Listening is essential when learning Mandarin, but not all listening situations are the same. By recognizing different types of listening, you can improve your chances of successfully navigating spoken Mandarin. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about listening comprehension, and we're going to analyze different types of listening to see what they require of you as a student and how you can meet the challenges that each poses. Before we do that though, I'd like to mention that my course, The Fluent Listener, is open for registration and will remain so until Thursday this week. To learn more about the course, you can go to listening.hackingchinese.com or use the link in the show notes. If you're listening to this in the future, you can still head over to the course page where you will be able to leave your email address so I can notify you when the course opens again. Okay, so when talking about different ways of listening, first we can split it into two depending on which way information flows. First, we have one-way listening, so that's when you're only listening, as it were, you are not participating in the conversation yourself. You might still be able to influence the listening situation somewhat, for example by pausing or adjusting the speed, but you are not actively participating and saying things yourself. Second, we have two-way listening, and this is in contrast then when you are yourself participating in the conversation. So listening to and understanding what other people are saying is not enough, you also need to formulate your own answer based on what they say. At first glance, it might seem that two-way listening is strictly more demanding than one-way listening, but this is not always the case. For example, when you are in a conversation yourself, the people you speak with can adjust their language to you, and this is rarely possible when you're listening to, say, a recording. And maybe you're not even part of the target audience of that recording, which will make it harder, but this is something we will get back to later. The point is that when you are in a conversation, it's possible to influence the listening situation, but this is not as easy when you're listening to a recording. Before we talk more about one-way listening, I'd like to mention that this episode is part of a series called Beyond tīng dǒng, where we try to analyze and go beyond simply stating that you don't understand something to try to understand why and also what we can do about it. You don't have to have listened to the earlier parts before listening to this one, but I recommend that you do after you're finished with this episode, so I'll put links to the other episodes in this series in the show notes. So let's talk a little bit more about one-way listening. This usually feels safer for students because you can focus solely on comprehension. You don't need to think about what you are going to say or how you're going to react to what somebody else says. You can simply focus on listening only. Examples of this would be listening to a podcast or maybe watching a YouTube video in Chinese. And if you want recommendations for which podcasts and YouTube channels to check out, I've written about that before, and as usual, I'll put links in the show notes. As mentioned earlier, one of the main benefits with one-way listening, usually through recordings then, is that you can use various tools that are not practical or socially acceptable to use in conversations. The most powerful one is to simply listen again. Right when you've finished listening to a section, or maybe the whole thing, you can just hit the replay button and listen one more time. This will drastically increase how much you understand without studying anything extra or looking up words or anything. Listening more than once is very easy and has many benefits, so it's something I recommend that you do. But of course, this requires you to have a recording. You can also use various other tools. For example, you can use a program like Audacity to slow down the rate of speech, or if you're watching a YouTube video, you can just change the playback speed to get it slightly slower. This gives you more time to process what you hear, and that is usually the problem for learners, that there's so much going on that you don't have time to process it. So if you slow it down by just 10 to 20%, you might just have enough time to parse what you're listening to a new level. By using software to slow down the Chinese you're listening to, you also maintain the same tone patterns as in full natural speech, which is not the case if you're listening to slow audio recorded for a textbook, for example. Still, even if one-way listening is easier in a certain sense, it can also be harder, because what if you're not in the target audience of the audio you're listening to? If you're in a conversation, people can adjust to what you say, but when somebody records something, it's probably not recorded for you specifically. And if you're listening to authentic content, i.e. content produced not specifically for language learning at all, you might be very different from the target group, and the target group, usually native speakers then, will know many things that you don't, and so that will make this type of listening very hard. I'd also like to point out that people sometimes say that listening is passive, but as we have seen throughout this series, listening comprehension is always an active process, and this is true for one-way listening as well. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, you should check out parts 2 to 4 in this series. What one-way listening feels like depends a lot on how it was produced, so let's have a closer look at that before we move on to two-way listening. You can think of this as a spectrum from spontaneous speech, which is not planned at all, to scripted speech, which is completely planned, essentially text read aloud. So spontaneous speech then, for example casual conversations and the like, contains a lot of pauses, fillers and self-corrections and the like, a lot of redundancies in other words, and this essentially means that the information density, so how much information is conveyed per unit time or per syllable spoken or what have you, is a lot lower than if the speech is planned. In some cases, the speech being spontaneous can also make it harder to follow because it has less structure and somebody might change their minds about how they're going to say something mid-sentence, and if you don't catch that, it will be harder to understand. And, for example, when people change topics, they don't let you know in advance, whereas if somebody's reading a text aloud, the text presumably contains indicators of when somebody's changing topics. When you're listening to somebody else's spontaneous conversations, it's also likely that they will not include all the details needed to understand what they're talking about, and this is because they assume that the person they're talking to understand and know certain things. And some of the time you will know these things too, and then it's fine, but usually you will not, and then that will make this type of listening harder. Next, we have planned speech, for example interviews, which is less spontaneous when it comes to what is being said. During an interview, for example, both parties probably know roughly what they are going to talk about, but they might not have formulated the questions in advance and the answers are not prepared either. It's also still a conversation, so people will repeat things the other person said, ask for clarification and things like that, and that also makes it easier to understand. Next, we have speech with written support, so maybe an oral presentation where you have prepared some things and you have slides, but you haven't prepared exactly how you're going to say every sentence. This is, for example, how I usually record this podcast. I know what I'm going to talk about because I've written an article about the same topic, but I don't plan the exact words I'm going to use. If you're listening to this type of content in Chinese, it can help immensely if you have access to the written support that the person who's speaking is using, and of course then if you're listening to an oral presentation, you can probably see the slides and so on, and this type of visual support can be very helpful. I'm not saying you should get a transcript of what's being said, because then you're reading, not listening, but getting keywords or looking at images, graphs, or similar visual support can be very helpful. Next up, we have scripted content, so a good example here would be movies. So this is language that's supposed to sound spontaneous, even if it is actually scripted. And movies, like I said, are one example of this, but so are textbook dialogues. It varies enormously how natural these sound, of course, so most movie dialogues sound more natural than your textbook, but I think we all know that real people in the real world typically don't speak like people do in movies. This should perhaps be the topic of a separate podcast episode, but in general, real-world conversations are a lot messier than movie dialogues. Finally, we reach the end of the spectrum, and that is written Chinese read aloud. And a good example of this would be news broadcasts. For most students, this is by far the hardest type of one-way listening, and that is because it is extremely dense. We have a lot of information being conveyed with every single syllable, and these syllables are usually delivered at a fairly fast pace. This is not strange, considering that written formal Chinese is very dense compared to, say, written formal English, and many words are abbreviated, or people, when they write, prefer shorter versions to get the same meaning across. This was indeed one of the factors I brought up in part 6 in this series, where we talked about why listening in Chinese is so hard. Now that we've gone through the spectrum, I think it should be clear that there are many different types of one-way listening, and this is important to regulate difficulty. Like I said, most students find written Chinese read aloud very difficult, but find it easier to follow an interview, for example. And if you are struggling to find listening content on your level, well, you should try to find content which is more spontaneous, has you as the target audience, and which isn't scripted and just read aloud. The more advanced you become, the more important it is that you vary your listening, so you don't only listen to one type of one-way listening, but include all of them, because they require different things of you and will teach you different things. Now that we have discussed one-way listening, let's talk about two-way listening. And this is then similar because you need to do all the things we just talked about, but now you also need to participate yourself. The speaking part of this is beyond the scope of this episode, but I think it should be abundantly clear that if you're also asked to produce language, not just understand it, that adds a lot of stress and is more demanding. It can also be demanding in different ways. Like I said earlier, many students feel it's safer to listen to a recording because you don't have to react or do anything yourself. But if you're listening to somebody else, you're in a social context, it could be both a positive and a negative thing, depending on your disposition, what the situation is like, and so on. But I think most people consider it more demanding than simply listening. There are several reasons for this, and one of them is the cognitive load I just mentioned. You simply have to do more things at once. But the affective factors here are also important. If you feel scared or anxious in a listening situation, this can certainly block what you hear and make comprehension harder, even if you would understand what was said if you were just listening. Generally speaking, the more people participate in a conversation, the more demanding it becomes. And this is, as I touched on earlier, because when you're alone in a conversation, the other person you're talking to can adjust to you, at least they have the option to do so if they know what you know, and they can see what you understand and maybe repair and say things again and so on. And you can also ask them to clarify, etc. When many people are involved in a conversation, the one speaking is not just addressing you, however, which means they can't really adapt to you as well as if you were in a one-on-one conversation. As a result of this, I think one of the hardest types of listening is being in a group conversation with native speakers, because most people will forget that you are there because they are not simply talking to you, they are talking to their friends, and their friends know a lot about them, and they are also native speakers, and they have a lot of cultural knowledge, etc., which essentially means that you will face all the challenges of one-way listening without having any of the benefits that listening to a recording has. To add insult to injury, spontaneous conversations in groups tend to jump between topics very rapidly, often without clearly signaling that this is happening. So before you realize that they are actually talking about something else than you thought they were talking about, they have already switched to the next topic, making it really hard to employ those top-down listening strategies we talked about earlier in this series. So what I'm saying here is that if you struggle with this type of conversation, that's not strange. I really do think it's one of the hardest things you can do when it comes to listening in Mandarin. So 加油 and keep at it, and you will get there eventually. Before you get there though, and this then applies to most learners, I think that one-on-one conversations are the best. This is particularly true for beginners, but I also think it applies to more advanced students. Let's have a look at some of the advantages of one-on-one conversations. First, there is a shared purpose and mutual understanding. You are both in the same conversation after all. You know where you are and why you are there, and you know what you're talking about, because you can't get very far in a conversation if only one person knows what's going on. You also know who the other person is, and you can know a lot about what they might say to you just based on that. Furthermore, everything being said in the conversation is meant for the other person, and that means that it is possible to adjust the language you use, and the other person can adjust their language, etc., and it's possible to use all sorts of conversation strategies. Second, and more about these strategies then, you can ask for clarification and negotiate meaning, which is not necessarily possible when there are more people. Yes, you can raise your hand and ask what something means in a conversation with 8 people, but this is socially very awkward and not something that you'll do all the time. Whereas in a one-on-one conversation, there is nothing wrong with asking for clarification when you don't understand. I should mention that this can also be a problem in one-on-one conversations, because if you're speaking with someone and you're talking about something interesting, constantly being interrupted by a question of what something means or how this word is used and why it's used like that can be rather annoying. Third, there is less variation in speakers and topics. In a group of 2, you are an active part in every possible interaction, which is not true if there is more than 2 people in the conversation. Following other people talking to each other is much harder than following someone talking to you. The fourth benefit is that your conversation partner can adapt to your level appropriately. And this is not necessarily something they will do. It also requires them to know what your level is and have some practice and experience adjusting their level, but all good teachers can do this, for example. Compare this with a group discussion where even a skilled teacher will find it difficult to adjust to everybody's individual level. And if the levels are different enough, this is literally impossible. So now that we know how awesome one-on-one conversations are, how do you go about starting one? Well, if you're the extroverted kind, you can just go and find Chinese native speakers. This might be very easy or very hard depending on where you live, but if you go online, you can certainly find people to talk to. If you're a more introverted student like me, I think setting up a formal relationship of some kind is good. For example, you can hire a teacher or you can find a language exchange partner and practice speaking that way. It's time to wrap up this episode. And I hope that by now it should be clear that listening is not a singular activity with fixed parameters, but that there are instead many different types of listening and that each type of listening has its own characteristics and therefore also its own challenges. Merely being aware of this can help, and as I said earlier, it can also help you adjust the difficulty, so you can seek out either more challenging listening, if that's your issue, or you can use what we've talked about in this episode to find types of listening that are easier for you, and this would maybe be more common. Are group conversations too hard for you? Well, try one-on-one conversations then. Do you find written Chinese read aloud too challenging? Well, switch to more spontaneous talk. For more about adjusting the difficulty of the Chinese you listen to and the role of listening on certain difficulty levels, check out episode 236, where we talked about the input pyramid. That episode is a video episode, and that's because it's also part of my course, The Fluent Listener, that I mentioned initially. So if you want more guidance when it comes to listening in Chinese, go check out my course, The Fluent Listener, at listening.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.